The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Commander Bastian Calloway pressed his throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine of his F-6F Hellcat, roaring through the humid air above the Philippine Sea. It was June 19, 1944, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Lexington behind him. His squadron had explicit orders: maintain defensive formation, protect the carrier group, engage only when directly threatened. But 6 miles ahead, through the haze of tropical morning light, Calloway could see them, a formation of Japanese aircraft approaching like a dark cloud of vengeance, their engines catching the sunlight like deadly fireflies. The smell of aviation fuel and hot metal filled his cockpit as sweat beaded on his forehead beneath his leather flight helmet. His hands gripped the control stick, knuckles white, heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to break formation, to charge headlong into that approaching swarm and turn the hunter into the hunted. The radio squawked again with Admiral Mitcher's repeated command: hold position, maintain defense. But Bastian Calloway had seen too many good men die following orders that made sense in briefing rooms, but crumbled under the weight of combat reality. He thought of the terrified faces of Japanese pilots he had seen bail out of burning Zeros just weeks earlier, their eyes wide with something he had never witnessed in enemy aviators before. Pure, undiluted fear. They were afraid of the Hellcat, afraid of what American naval aviation had become, and in that moment, Calloway realized that fear could be weaponized more effectively than any cannon or machine gun. No one in Task Force 58 knew that one man's decision to disobey direct orders that morning would fundamentally transform aerial combat doctrine and turn the Philippine Sea into a graveyard for the Japanese Navy's finest pilots. Bastian Calloway had grown up in the wheat fields of Nebraska, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, and the sky seemed large enough to swallow a man's dreams whole. His father, Henrik Calloway, had been a crop duster pilot who taught his son that flying was less about conquering the air than learning to dance with it. Born in 1921 in the small farming town of Albion, Bastian had spent his childhood watching his father's yellow biplane weave between grain silos and power lines with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The family farm had struggled through the Depression, but Henrik never sold his plane, insisting that some things were worth more than money, like the freedom to touch the clouds whenever the weight of earthbound troubles became too heavy to bear. When Bastian graduated from high school in 1939, he had two choices: take over the struggling farm or follow his father into the cockpit. He chose the sky. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything, transforming a farm boy's dreams of crop dusting into something far more urgent and deadly. Bastian enlisted in the Navy 3 days after December 7, 1941, driven not by hatred, but by a quiet determination that had been shaped by years of watching his father coax life from stubborn soil. At naval flight training in Pensacola, Florida, he proved to be a natural pilot but a reluctant follower of rigid military protocol. His instructors noted his exceptional spatial awareness and aggressive flying style, but they also documented his tendency to question orders that seemed tactically unsound. He graduated third in his class despite receiving multiple demerits for unauthorized flight maneuvers, earning his wings in March of 1943 with a reputation as both a gifted aviator and a potential disciplinary problem. His first assignment was to Fighter Squadron 2 with a newly formed Air Group 5 aboard the USS Yorktown, where he would learn to fly the aircraft that would make him famous and feared across the Pacific, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The other pilots in his squadron initially viewed him with suspicion, seeing his farm boy background and unconventional thinking as liabilities in the highly regimented world of carrier aviation. But Calloway earned their respect through countless hours of practice flights, pushing his Hellcat through maneuvers that seemed to defy both physics and common sense. always returning to the carrier with insights about the aircraft's capabilities that even veteran pilots had never considered. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between the United States Navy and the most devastating air attack the Japanese had ever planned. By June of 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical turning point, with American forces poised to capture the Mariana Islands and establish air bases within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. The strategic importance of this campaign could not be overstated. Whoever controlled the Marianas would control the flow of supplies and reinforcements across the Central Pacific, effectively determining the outcome of the war. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 58 represented the largest concentration of naval aviation power in human history, with 15 aircraft carriers and nearly 1,000 aircraft spread across 4 task groups covering hundreds of square miles of ocean. Opposing them was the Japanese First Mobile Fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a desperate force of 9 carriers and 430 aircraft that represented the last hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy to halt American advances toward the homeland. The stakes were astronomical. If the Americans succeeded in capturing Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, Japan's strategic position in the Pacific would become untenable, and the war would essentially be over. But if the Japanese could inflict a decisive defeat on the American carrier force, they might buy enough time to fortify their remaining island strongholds and force a negotiated peace. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had emerged as the dominant fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater, boasting a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. Its rugged construction, powerful engine, and heavy armament made it superior to the famous Mitsubishi A6M0 in almost every category except maneuverability. But the true terror that Japanese pilots experienced when facing the Hellcat came not from its technical specifications, but from the psychological impact of repeated, overwhelming defeats. By 1944, veteran Japanese aviators spoke of the Hellcat in hushed, fearful tones, describing encounters with American pilots who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and vanish before retaliation was possible. The Japanese had lost over 60% of their experienced carrier pilots during the previous year of fighting, forcing them to send barely trained teenagers into combat against seasoned American veterans flying superior aircraft. Intelligence reports suggested that many Japanese pilots were experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as combat trauma, with some refusing to engage American fighters even when ordered to do so. The upcoming battle over the Marianas would test whether numerical disadvantage and psychological warfare could overcome traditional tactical doctrine. The morning of June 19th began with routine combat air patrol assignments, but tension filled the ready rooms of every American carrier as radar operators reported massive Japanese air formations approaching from the west. Admiral Mark Mitcher had positioned his task force in a defensive stance, with fighter squadrons assigned to specific altitude layers and engagement zones designed to provide overlapping coverage for the vulnerable carriers below. The plan was methodical, cautious, and completely dependent on pilots following their assigned positions regardless of tactical opportunities that might present themselves. Lieutenant Commander Kellaway sat in his cockpit aboard the USS Lexington, listening to the increasingly frantic radio chatter as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on radar screens. His wingman, Lieutenant Cornelius Thorne, a quiet banker's son from Boston, kept checking his fuel gauge and ammunition counters, betraying the nervousness that even veteran pilots felt before major engagements. Behind them in the formation, Ensign Dashiell Pierce, fresh from flight school but already showing the cold precision of a natural killer, maintained perfect radio silence while methodically testing his guns and flight controls. The squadron commander's voice cut through the radio static with crisp, urgent orders. maintain assigned altitude of 15,000 feet, engage only aircraft that directly threaten the task force, conserve ammunition for multiple waves of attacks. But as the first Japanese formations came into visual range, Kellaway could see the flaw in the defensive strategy. The enemy bombers were flying in tight formations that would be nearly impossible to break up with piecemeal attacks from scattered defending fighters. Traditional doctrine called for intercepting bombers at maximum range to disrupt their formations before they could reach their targets. But the current orders would allow the Japanese to maintain cohesion until the final moments of their attack runs. Through his binoculars, he could see the distinctive silhouettes of Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bombers and Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, aircraft that could sink a carrier with a single, well-placed hit. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Even if American fighters shot down 70% of the attacking aircraft, the remaining 30% would be enough to cause catastrophic damage to the task force. Kellaway's mind raced through the tactical possibilities, calculating angles of attack, ammunition expenditure, and fuel consumption with the instinctive precision that had made him one of the most feared pilots in the Pacific Fleet. He thought it was over, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. The radio crackled again with updates from the Combat Information Center. Estimated enemy strength at 400 aircraft in multiple waves, closing distance at high speed. Defensive positions must be maintained at all costs. But Kellaway could see something that the radar operators and tactical coordinators could not. The Japanese formations were flying with the rigid precision of pilots who had been drilled in formation flying, but lacked the combat experience to adapt when those formations came under attack. They were following predetermined flight paths with mathematical precision, making them predictable targets for any pilot bold enough to abandon defensive positions and press home aggressive attacks. His hands tightened on the controls as he made a decision that would either save the task force or end his naval career. And then the moment arrived that would define not just the battle, but the entire future of carrier aviation warfare. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached to within gun range, Lieutenant Commander Kellaway suddenly broke from formation without authorization, his Hellcat climbing at maximum throttle toward a formation of 18 Judy dive bombers that were preparing to roll into their attack runs on the carriers below. Lieutenant Thorne's voice crackled over the radio in alarm, demanding that Kellaway return to formation, but the Nebraska farm boy had already committed to a course of action that flew in the face of every tactical manual ever written by the United States Navy. Instead of making a single high-speed pass and returning to defensive positions as doctrine dictated, Kellaway dove straight into the center of the Japanese formation, with his guns blazing, forcing the enemy pilots to break their carefully planned attack pattern and engage in individual dogfights that negated their numerical advantage. His first burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire caught a Judy pilot completely by surprise, the armor-piercing rounds tearing through the aircraft's engine, cowling and igniting its fuel system in a spectacular explosion that sent burning wreckage tumbling toward the ocean 4 miles below. The psychological impact on the remaining Japanese pilots was immediate and devastating. Instead of maintaining their disciplined approach to the American carriers, they scattered in all directions, their attack formation dissolving into a chaotic melee of individual aircraft desperately trying to survive rather than complete their mission. Kellaway pressed his advantage ruthlessly, using the Hellcat's superior speed and firepower to pursue fleeing bombers with a relentless aggression that bordered on reckless. Within 3 minutes, he had shot down 4 Japanese aircraft and damaged 2 others so severely that they were forced to abandon their attack runs and limp back toward their carriers with smoking engines and shattered cockpits. Ensign Pierce, watching from his assigned defensive position, later described the scene as resembling a hawk attacking a flock of sparrows, with Kellaway's Hellcat appearing everywhere at once like some kind of aerial ghost. But the true genius of Kellaway's unauthorized attack became apparent when other American pilots, inspired by his example, began abandoning their defensive positions and pressing home similar aggressive assaults on Japanese formations. Squadron after squadron of Hellcats broke from their assigned patrol areas and dove into the enemy formations with devastating effect, turning what should have been a coordinated Japanese attack into a slaughter that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The radio channels erupted with excited voices reporting kill after kill as American pilots discovered that aggressive offense was far more effective than passive defense. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison from Fighter Squadron 16 radioed in amazement that he had just watched 3 Japanese pilots bail out of undamaged aircraft rather than engage his approaching Hellcat, evidence that the psychological impact of Kellaway's attack was spreading throughout the enemy formations like a contagion of fear. Within 30 minutes, the first wave of Japanese aircraft had been virtually annihilated, with only a handful of damaged bombers managing to escape back toward their carriers. But Kellaway was not finished. As the second wave of enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon, he realized that the same aggressive tactics could be applied on an even larger scale, turning the entire American fighter force into a weapon of psychological warfare that would shatter Japanese morale completely. The second wave of Japanese aircraft approached with noticeably less confidence than the first, their formations looser and their flight paths more erratic as word of the catastrophic losses had somehow reached the incoming pilots. Kellaway, his ammunition running low but his fuel still adequate for extended combat, made another decision that would have resulted in court-martial under normal circumstances. He led his entire squadron in a coordinated attack on a formation of 24 Zero fighters that were escorting a group of torpedo bombers toward the American carriers. The Zero had once been the most feared fighter aircraft in the world, but by June of 1944, it had been surpassed by American designs in every category except turning radius. What Kellaway understood and what traditional naval doctrine had failed to grasp was that the Zero's remaining advantage could be negated entirely by attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing Japanese pilots to choose between maintaining formation discipline and engaging individual American fighters. His tactical innovation was brutally simple. Instead of engaging the Zeros in traditional one-on-one dogfights, where their superior maneuverability might provide some advantage, he directed his pilots to attack the enemy formation from 6 different angles simultaneously, creating a chaotic engagement that favored the Hellcat's superior firepower and armored construction. Lieutenant Thorne, following his squadron leader's example despite his reservations about disobeying orders, dove on 2 Zeros from above while they were engaged with Kellaway's frontal attack, shooting both aircraft down in flames before their pilots could react to the new threat. Ensign Pierce, demonstrating the cold calculation that would make him one of the war's leading aces, positioned his Hellcat to intercept any Zeros that might try to escape the engagement, methodically destroying 3 enemy fighters as they attempted to flee the slaughter. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was even more devastating than the physical losses. Veteran aviators who had once dominated Pacific skies found themselves completely helpless against American tactics that seemed to anticipate their every move. Several Japanese pilots were observed by American air crews abandoning their aircraft in mid-flight rather than continue fighting, their parachutes blossoming like white flowers against the brilliant blue of the tropical sky. The torpedo bombers, left without fighter escort, became easy targets for other American squadrons that had adopted Kellaway's aggressive approach, with 14 of the 18 aircraft shot down before they could reach torpedo release range. But perhaps most significantly, the few Japanese pilots who survived the encounter returned to their carriers with reports of American fighting capabilities that bordered on the supernatural, describing Hellcat pilots who seemed to appear from thin air and strike with the precision of guided missiles. These reports, combined with the massive aircraft losses, would contribute to a collapse in Japanese pilot morale that would persist for the remainder of the war. By late afternoon, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost over 400 aircraft and most of their experienced aircrew, while American losses totaled only 29 aircraft, with most pilots recovered by search and rescue operations. The mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory had become undeniably apparent to even the most optimistic officers in Admiral Ozawa's fleet. The immediate aftermath of what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot saw Lieutenant Commander Kellaway facing a disciplinary hearing that could have ended his naval career and resulted in court-martial for disobeying direct orders during combat operations. Admiral Mitcher himself conducted the inquiry, grilling Kellaway for over 2 hours about his decision to abandon defensive formations and engage in unauthorized offensive operations. The transcript of that hearing, preserved in Naval Archives, reveals the fundamental tension between traditional military discipline and innovative tactical thinking that would reshape American naval doctrine for decades to come. When asked why he had disobeyed explicit orders to maintain defensive positions, Kellaway replied simply that he had seen an opportunity to prevent enemy aircraft from reaching their targets and had acted on his tactical assessment of the situation. Admiral Mitcher pressed him on the risks involved, noting that his unauthorized attack could have left the carriers vulnerable if the Japanese had been flying a deception operation with additional aircraft held in reserve. Kellaway acknowledged the risks, but pointed out that passive defense would have guaranteed some enemy aircraft would reach the carriers, while aggressive offense had the potential to prevent all attacks from succeeding. The hearing concluded with Admiral Mitcher delivering what appeared to be a stern reprimand, but privately recommending Kellaway for promotion and decoration for his innovative tactical thinking. Within a week, new standing orders were distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet, incorporating the aggressive engagement tactics that Kellaway had pioneered, fundamentally changing how American naval aviation would approach combat for the remainder of the war. Fighter squadrons that had previously been assigned purely defensive missions were retrained to conduct offensive sweeps designed to break up enemy formations before they could mount coordinated attacks. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots became a deliberate element of American tactical planning, with intelligence officers studying captured documents that revealed the growing fear and demoralization among enemy aircrew. Lieutenant Thorne, who had initially questioned Kellaway's decision to break formation, became one of the most vocal advocates for the new aggressive tactics, eventually rising to command his own squadron and training dozens of pilots in the methods that had proved so devastatingly effective. Ensign Pierce continued to fly with cold precision, accumulating a final total of 23 confirmed kills, while crediting Kellaway's tactical innovations with saving his life on multiple occasions. But perhaps the most telling indicator of the impact of Kellaway's actions came from Japanese sources themselves. Captured documents revealed that pilot training programs had been modified to include specific instruction on how to recognize and avoid the aggressive attack patterns that American fighters had begun employing throughout the Pacific theater. Following the war, Bastian Kellaway returned to Nebraska with a chest full of decorations and a reputation as one of the most innovative tactical thinkers in naval aviation history. But he spoke rarely about his combat experiences and never considered himself a hero. He married his childhood sweetheart, Evangeline Thatcher, in September of 1945 and took over the family farm that his father had somehow managed to keep running, despite wartime labor shortages and equipment rationing. The transition from aerial combat to agricultural routine might have seemed jarring to outside observers, but Kellaway found peace in the rhythms of planting and harvest that connected him to the soil his grandfather had first worked in 1897. He flew crop dusters during the busy season, using the same Grumman biplane his father had purchased before the war, and neighbors often noted that he approached farming with the same methodical precision that had made him legendary in the Pacific Fleet. Letters began arriving from former squadron mates within months of his return, sharing news of their own civilian transitions and expressing gratitude for the tactical lessons that had kept them alive through the remainder of the war. Lieutenant Thorne, now a successful investment banker in Boston, wrote annually on the anniversary of the turkey shoot to thank Kellaway for teaching him that sometimes the most dangerous course of action was following orders that made no tactical sense. Ensign Pierce, who had become a commercial airline pilot, credited Kellaway's aggressive tactics with giving him the confidence to make split-second decisions in civilian aviation that had prevented several potential accidents. But perhaps the most moving correspondence came from families of pilots who had never met Kellaway, but whose sons had been trained by officers who had served under him during the war. A mother from Oregon wrote to thank him for tactical innovations that had saved her son's life during the final months of fighting, while a father from Texas sent photographs of grandchildren whose existence he attributed directly to combat methods that had brought his pilot son safely home. The ripple effects of a single decision to disobey orders on June 19, 1944, continued to spread through decades of peacetime life, touching people who would never know the name of the farm boy from Nebraska who had fundamentally changed the way America fought and won aerial battles. Military historians began studying the turkey shoot as early as 1947, recognizing that the engagement represented a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in the development of modern air combat doctrine. Kellaway's tactical innovations were incorporated into pilot training programs at the Naval War College and eventually influenced the development of jet fighter tactics during the Korean conflict. He never called himself a hero. The mathematical precision of what Lieutenant Commander Bastian Kellaway accomplished on that June morning in 1944 becomes even more remarkable when examined through the lens of statistical analysis and long-term strategic impact. The traditional defensive tactics employed by American carrier fighter squadrons prior to the turkey shoot had achieved respectable but not decisive results, typically intercepting 60 to 70% of attacking aircraft, while allowing 20 to 30% to reach their targets. But Kellaway's aggressive approach achieved a destruction rate of over 90% in the first wave and completely disrupted the attack coordination of subsequent waves, effectively reducing Japanese offensive capability to zero. The psychological impact proved equally quantifiable. Intelligence reports documented a 40% increase in Japanese pilot sick leave requests following the battle, with many experienced aviators claiming medical conditions that would prevent them from flying combat missions. Training accidents in Japanese flight schools increased dramatically as instructors struggled to prepare new pilots for the aggressive American tactics that had emerged from the turkey shoot, with some programs experiencing accident rates that exceeded combat losses. The strategic implications rippled far beyond the immediate battle, as Japanese naval planners were forced to abandon offensive carrier operations entirely and retreat to a purely defensive posture that would characterize their final year of the war. American industrial capacity, already producing aircraft at unprecedented rates, began manufacturing fighters specifically optimized for the aggressive tactics that Kellaway had pioneered, with new designs emphasizing firepower and durability over traditional measures of performance. The Vought F-4U Corsair, Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and eventually the jet-powered fighters of the early Cold War all reflected tactical lessons learned from the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But perhaps most significantly, the battle demonstrated that individual initiative and innovative thinking could overcome numerical disadvantages and establish doctrine when applied with courage and precision. Military academies around the world began incorporating the turkey shoot into their curricula as an example of how one officer's willingness to take calculated risks could alter the course of entire campaigns. The fear that Japanese pilots experienced when facing American fighters became a studied phenomenon in military psychology, influencing everything from pilot training methods to aircraft design philosophy. Modern air forces continue to study Kellaway's tactical innovations as examples of how to achieve psychological dominance over technically competent adversaries through aggressive and unpredictable engagement patterns. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have seen the mathematical certainty that passive defense meant accepting unacceptable losses? Or would you have followed the comfortable predictability of established doctrine? The choice that Bastian Kellaway made in the skies above the Philippine Sea continues to resonate through military thinking 7 decades later, a reminder that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in following orders, but in recognizing when those orders are wrong and having the moral strength to act on that recognition. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means. The willingness to risk everything in defense of principles larger than personal safety or career advancement. The understanding that true victory sometimes requires abandoning the comfort of consensus and embracing the terrifying responsibility of individual decision.